Welcome, everyone. My name is William Wright. I work for the LA chapter of the American Institute of Architects, and you have joined us for a panel that we have done in a series of programs in response to the tragic wildfires. Our heart goes out to everyone that's been personally and professionally impacted by these terrible fires, and we as a chapter are here for you. So please make sure you're reaching out to us and letting us know the type of resources and the type of initiatives you'd like for us to get more involved with to help. With that said, I look forward to having everyone on this call join in a very interactive Q&A. We will first start with a series of introductions and then our presentation from our distinguished speakers. And then in the meantime, I encourage everyone to keep yourself on mute unless you are actively participating in the discussion, which we do encourage during the Q&A part. And in the meantime, also, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and to share any questions, any resources, etc. Right now, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce the co-chairs of the AIA-LA Wildfire Task Force, Greg Kochanowski and Mohammed Sharif. So with that, we'll go into introductions, and then the presentation will begin soon. Thank you. Welcome, Greg.
Hi, thanks, Will. Just to give you a little bit of a introduction to this webinar, this is a little bit different from the other webinars that we've done in that it's not about individual home rebuilding. It's really more about exploring the critical role of infrastructure and community support systems in supporting long-term resilience, sort of following disasters. And so the conversations will move beyond individual property rebuilding and focus more on strategies that strengthen communities as a whole. And there's a variety of ways in which people will engage with that. I'll pitch it off to Mohammed now.
Ditto what Greg said. I'd like to invite our first speaker to proceed, and if you would self-introduce, that would be great.
Heather, why don't you start off? We'll do introductions first. Heather, why don't you go, and then Casey, and then we'll kick off the presentations with Brittany.
Okay, fantastic. Hi, everybody. I'm Heather Rosenberg. I'm a resilience leader with AIA, which you may know is a global engineering design consulting firm that focuses a lot on sustainable development and total design. So very interdisciplinary, and we have been thinking about all aspects of resilience in an integrated way for a long time. Our team is focused really on a systems-based approach to addressing wicked problems. And what we find in terms of shaping a better world and what that really means is looking at the nexus of resilience, sustainability, and equity at the same time, and how do we think about that? So that's what we're here to talk about today. And I'm not an architect, I'm an ecologist by training, and really thinking about things all together. And I love architects and work with them all the time. So really happy to be here. Casey, next.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Heather. Casey Castor, Director of Sustainability with Practice here in Pasadena. We're a design firm working in the public environments, whether that's K-12 schools, higher education, affordable housing, and some civic-based work. My background is in building science. I'm also the AIA LA Committee on the Environment's Vice Chair this year, but a lot of my work here is kind of focused in energy, water, carbon, daylight, all those kind of sustainability aspects of the design process that we implement. But beyond that, kind of some focused research into distributed energy resources, whether that's wind and solar, how that feeds back to the buildings and ultimately provides these off-grid or more resilient base spaces, and some wildfire-related emission studies and things like that. So that's kind of my background coming into this. Thank you. Brittany?
Delighted to be here. So Brittany Moffat, I'm a senior resilience engineer with AIA in Los Angeles. And so I started as a facade engineer thinking about systems at a small but arguably very, very important scale. And now look at it from the city community. What are the impacts? How do you really think from a systems perspective, and how do we do better as a comes to adaptation and resilience building. So I will go ahead and share my screen and take the lead to talk you through a few things off the bat. So a lot of the conversation today is around resilience hubs and kind of seeding resilience in communities. And what I'm hoping to kind of talk you through is the why first. Like this is a term that you may have heard a lot of recently or in the past few years. Some folks here may have been involved in the design assistance of resilience hubs. Like, why is this becoming such a hot topic? Secondly, what is it that a resilience hub refers to? I think that it's similar to a lot of buzzwords. We can use it a lot without having kind of shared clarity on what it is that we're talking about. Um, why is it hard? And then a little bit of challenging what it is and what it can be, and thinking about looking at this from a distributed scale and some of what I would love to see as we move forward in thinking about resilient design. So this is a horrible slide that I use a lot. This is the National Climate Assessment from a couple of years ago. So this is the State of the Union when it comes to climate science at a time when that was supported by the government. So this was in the 80s. The U.S. experienced $1 billion disaster once every 4 months, and now that's once every 3 weeks. And the report does a beautiful job of articulating not so much the future, but look at just the past couple of decades, the impacts are really unprecedented and unequal. And so that is compounded by looking at how events are escalating. You see areas like Asheville, North Carolina, that there's a million articles about it being a safe haven, and how the level of destruction last fall. And of course, we see that really viscerally in our own neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Um, this this is kind of the context, and I know we're all engaging with this pretty actively in our work, but with that pressure is being put onto a system that is overstretched at a baseline. I look over my partner's shoulders constantly, and she's an emergency doctor in Los Angeles, with concern about like the general state of things, because there's often an 8-hour wait to see her in the emergency room. And that's, we're not in the middle of COVID, like we're not immediately post earthquake. So the second there's the additional stress of a climate event or other type of disaster, there's so many people that fall through the cracks, and we've seen the need for more accessible points of support. So resilience hubs are a tool, right? It's like one of many things that need to be showing up so that there's more available community support to reduce the poor health outcomes that we're seeing. So what is a resilience hub? This is from the Community Environmental Council. I think they're really helpful characteristics describing, it's designed in partnership with the community and grounded in neighborhood knowledge. It's embedded in the community fabric. It's a known and trusted resource, and it's equipped and prepared for resilience services. And that, there's an important element of this that is self-determining and supporting communities and self-determination. There's another important part of having it being a known entity, so that in a time of disruption, you know where to show up and what to expect, what kind of services. Like, you'll know if you can be supported, if you'll need to show your ID, if you'll, if people will speak your language, like all of these elements that make something actually an available resource. And when we say equipped and prepared for resilience, there's a whole spectrum of what that can include. So it needs to be safe, and maybe that's clean air, cooling, heating, power access, information, food, the things that you see on this list. And often in this conversation, we're talking about the role of backup power, and I'll Casey get into this more deeply, to provide those services even during power disruptions. When is a resilience hub? Now, this is from USDN, because I think their definitions are like, I'd argue that it's the industry standard. It's every day, it's during a disruption, and it's during recovery, right? It is every day in the sense that it's essential space that can address root causes of vulnerability. That could be a range of services. I worked with groups that like are trying to just work on energy burden, and having a lot of programming around that. It's during that time of disruption, so those services that you saw on the previous slide, and then it's after the event itself. So you can often picture Red Cross and other organizations really activating during uh, uh, whether it's a heat wave or as we've seen most recently in the aftermath of the wildfires. The core challenge here, so this is coming from our experience getting to support organizations that are kind of outsetting on their journey to retrofit to become resilience hubs, is that so often the buildings that would do the most good are very difficult to have PV and power and backup power integrated. That they tend to be older communities, or sorry, older buildings. There could be code issues. There's so much to solve in order to enhance the ability to serve the folks that they serve so well day to day. And this leads me to really a key takeaway, and maybe an unwelcome flashback for a lot of folks in this audience. But if you've seen Pimp My Ride, the overarching concept is people needed a car, and then in a very entertaining way, they received like a car and a tanning bed, like, or a movie theater. Like it really was all the best bells and whistles in some ways. Ridiculously, uh, overstating it a little, but trying to make the point that the side of like the whole list of everything it can be, and sometimes we see grants that are tied to that kind of laundry list, checklist is amazing to aim for, but it doesn't need to be the only option. That there fundamentally kind of needs to be a spectrum when we think about resilience hubs, and maybe it's divorcing ourselves from the term a little bit and thinking a little bit more around just community resilient services, that how buildings can be better equipped to support communities and community organizations showing up. This is in working with a really awesome union that's exploring converting a few of their office buildings into resilience hubs. This is kind of where we came to in thinking about it, that like, yes, there's the A and B that we often think of overnight shelter or refuge during a big disaster. But if you don't have the space for it, but you do have outdoor space and it's accessible, like what if that's the point of resource distribution, right? We've seen so many schools and different other organizations during COVID become this, or it's resource dispatch, and it's going out to households, or it's really just like the information hub. Like, are you using the backup power, for example, to be something of a call center, so that a network of individuals or a network within an organization or across organizations can better assemble. And thinking about it across, of course, what we just experienced, but the rest of what we're up against in Southern California, like I keep thinking about the wildfires as not our final boss, but our most recent test, and taking what we've learned into how do we prepare for the big earthquake? Like, how do we think about flooding? And some of the organizations that we've worked with in Los Angeles, like their um, their protocol, right? Their guidebook of operations includes things like mental health crises and ice raids. Like there's so many other types of disruptions that can be extremely relevant, that these whether they're hubs or supercharged resources could help fill the need for support on. So when we're thinking about it, we're thinking about it as like, okay, what can the building, what is it set up to do? What kind of resource can it be? How can it be retrofit to do more, or serve more, or be more adaptive? We look at it in terms of what its vulnerability is to those hazards in the first place. We look at the site and surrounding for, what would disrupt access? Is there a risk of damage? And then we look at the local community context of, what does it mean in terms of partnerships, right? Like it's one group from Blue Sky Center had a good point that they're not trying to be everything to everyone. It's so important to show up in context and in partnership with the other resources that already exist within the same community space. And critically to think about it, I know we're certainly building nerds, and I say this with love about all of us here, but thinking about it in terms of who's operating, I think that that's come up as a really important question as we're doing audits of buildings to see like, yes, great if the building is totally resilient and has backup power and solar, but if no one can access it because the flooding that happened from the atmospheric river has cut off access for like this side of the city, or if there's concerns around like security, or there's other pieces that kind of need to be baked together in conversation with what is it that the community needs in the first place. So a little rambling, but the key takeaway that I'm trying to drive towards is this spectrum and this conception of resilience hubs as a really distributed resource, that in a way, like every building should be able to show up better, or we as designers and creators or assisters, if you will, of the built environment can look for opportunities to help buildings be better resources to be activated. I look at, the the image to the left is from Japan that shows a couple of the stickers that you can see in convenience stores, and this is part of their thinking around the next earthquake, to clarify that, oh, if you see that sticker and you go to that 7-Eleven, they will help you walk home, right? Or there's other ones where it's indicating that they have water. Like it's that clarification of what is the immediate aftermath look like, and who can you turn to. And I think that's like one side of the spectrum. There's a piece around, if you're designing a residential building, even just looking at backing up the community center or the lobby space with power, so backed up outlets that folks can plug their devices into, or have a community fridge for that's connected to backup power, that people can put medication in, eh, all the way to like, let's have some of these facilities fully fit the USDN definition and do the full spectrum, but what are the pieces along the way that can kind of be distributed across the board? So I will hand off there to Casey to talk a little bit more about, okay, on the right side of the equation, what does that look like in practice?
Awesome. Thanks, Brittany. That was wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about what is a microgrid, grid connection, and kind of interoperability with the grid networks, building energy design, kind of affiliated to these backup use cases. How are you managing these loads and getting them down to certain levels for disaster relief kind of side of things? And then community microgrids, a little bit about funding, a little bit about how that might ultimately work out. So just kind of jumping in with what is a microgrid. Microgrid is a local electrical grid that's defined by these boundaries. So in this specific image you're seeing here, this is a single family home looking at potentially all electrified equipment where it's fed by a backup battery. There's other conditions where there may be a generator, but it's a specific grid that can kind of island itself from that grid connection and be able to operate specific means during a separate timeline during disaster times. And then looking a little bit deeper into what kind of equipment that specifically looks at, this is single family home condition. I'll talk a little bit more about other building typologies beyond single family and kind of jumping back and forth as we kind of move through this. But, this single family home use case is really just having your solar, if it's electrified, battery pack, your inverter, and then a real big part of it is the energy management device, being able to switch loads to different areas as needed, especially when you are in a time where you're without grid power. What are those backed up loads? What are those non-essential loads that you're not backing up during that timeline? And then feeding that back ultimately to potentially a smart meter with the grid that's really starting to come more into the norm with these kind of grid interoperability connections. And then having this monitoring platform where you can see where the loads are going, how much is being used associated with your specific building. Looking a little bit closer, this is just, again, your kind of battery packs or energy management device, inverter, and meter. This is basically what the simple side of it is of what you need in a single family home condition to set up your microgrid to operate separately. That would connect back to your electrical panel and your breaker panel, which you can kind of use a little bit more analog and switching off specific breakers in your home when you might not need certain areas, or focusing on specific elements during these times of need. And as I kind of mentioned, there's also this kind of off-grid system where you also include a generator. This is a lot of times with the backup power coming from, whether this is diesel, natural gas, especially in the time of need when you do not have a specific battery backup. But some of these newer batteries, they can actually last about 12 to 24 hours. So it's really just kind of focusing on what energy loads are being used during that timeline and how you can continually operate over a multi-day period, especially when you are islanded from the grid and the grid is out for a power outage. And then this is another kind of element of this that's really been kind of coming into the picture in the last 2 or 3 years, which is a virtual power plant. A VPP is what they call it. So this is basically a cloud-based network where right now PG&E is working with a few different programs up in the Bay Area, basically connecting to, I think it was around 200 or 300 homes where these individuals could basically have this monitoring system connected back to their batteries. So if there was some sort of event, they could see that, okay, these batteries actually have 90% power. They can pull that back to the grid to surcharge other areas and support electrical infrastructure and that power to other areas, and they get some sort of payback. So really kind of looking into the grid as kind of this arteries of the human and being able to move the energy where needed, especially in times of this kind of disaster when they're not turning on a peaker plant or what have you. Kind of the future potential of grid interoperability, especially at the community scale. And then I just wanted to get a little bit deeper into the building energy use, off-grid procedures, and kind of this is more standardized. And I think that was really nice of what Brittany was just talking about before, as there's all these other opportunities for existing infrastructure that's not necessarily exactly built out right now or could be retrofitted to support these kind of energy use needs, especially in the time of a disaster like we're seeing in other countries. But within our office, we really focus on a pretty simple 3-part energy procedure. When we're talking about any sort of building design, whether that's existing or new construction, is really utilizing your passive design. That's going to reduce a certain amount of energy load. And then naturally your active design, whether that's high efficiency equipment or other types of equipment, that's your main loading. And then offsetting that with the energy generation and the storage that you would have on site. So going a little bit deeper into passive design strategies, this is looking at a competition project we did this last year, which was focused on a school. So really kind of focused on the building orientation, positioning that structure for, sunlight for solar panels, as well as natural daylight and ventilation, using thermal mass of some of these different materials to allow for this building to be more passively heated and cooled, where in the morning time you could come in, it's actually like 60 degrees in there, and slowly that heat or the cooling dissipates from this thermal mass into the space. So you're not actually turning on equipment until potentially 1 or 2 p.m. in the afternoon because it's self-cooling itself from the overnight cooling and the ground cooling that's coming from the thermal mass. Insulation and air sealing, obviously that's critical when we're talking about wildfire-based events and making sure it's sealed appropriately, making sure there's appropriate screens to stop ember and sparks from coming into the space. Natural ventilation, whether that's opening and closing of windows manually or actually having a system that does it automatically when it knows that outside conditions are at optimal, and it can let that ventilation come through the space. Daylighting, making sure that there's natural daylighting in these spaces. And then biophilia is a big one, making sure that there is that connection to the outdoors within these spaces for health and wellness. And as we're kind of going into the energy design of things, this is looking at high performance energy design of a building, whether that's single family. This is kind of across the board, any building design you're working on is looking at your annual energy use. Using those passive strategies to get that reduction, depending on the project typologies, location, you can get up to 70% passive reduction just through those design moves that you're doing up front. Highly recommend using building science and metrics to get those actual data to prove that the design moves you're using are getting these reductions. But it could be up to 70%, typically 20 to 70. And then utilizing your efficiency reductions of your equipment within the building. Naturally, we're here in California, Title 24 is pretty good, but you could do better as far as those reductions to get the overall energy use in gray. Here, that is what you're going to have for your annual loading of the building. And then typically what you need to do for energy generation for a net zero project, you would have to have about 100 to 125% of the annual energy use in the solar production, because there are going to be losses from the battery. There's going to be certain days that it's not producing appropriate amount comparative to your energy use. And then as you look on the right, now we're talking about an off-grid condition where potentially one of these resiliency hubs is working multi-day sequences off-grid. You're going to have to increase that solar panels or the energy source that you're using to be able to continue for multi-day use. But as we kind of go into some more of the tiered loading, I'll talk about in a minute, there's ways to not go into such a high level of solar, because obviously there's only so much roof space, and in single family homes, there isn't always that roof space available. And then looking into energy storage side of this, so looking at the left here first, a net zero design, so you need that 100 to 125% of the energy generation compared to your annual energy use. And then similarly for your battery, you're going to have to upsize that to make sure that you're getting through these single day functions, where you're making sure that it's at the highest single day energy use to make sure you can offset that loads. And then on the right is looking at an off-grid design where it's 150 to 200% of the energy generation to get through the multi-day functions and disaster relief. And that's for all the energy functions. Again, I'll note some more specifics on tiered loading in a second. And then the energy storage also has to be larger there as you're talking about being able to provide enough energy use for those multiple days at once. Really, you're thinking about how much solar is generating during that timeline, and then being able to save enough into the battery that gets you through these evening and into emergency backup. Because if you're disconnected from the grid, you didn't have the battery storage that got you into that evening time, and then now you don't have the energy. If you're being able to save energy while you're producing from the solar during the day, it gets you through those evening and into the next day when the sun becomes apparent again. And this one specifically is talking about more of the current standard tiered loading systems for emergency operations. Tier 1 is really mission critical. That's the life sustaining loads. That's your refrigeration, emergency lighting, smoke alarms, medical, power controls. Tier 2 is the priority load. So that's your general lighting, your HVAC, and definitely different use cases, such as like a resiliency center. HVAC might go into number 1, especially as we're talking about filtration and having air quality and cooling spaces if it is a time of the year where there is a lot of heat. And then other priority loads would be your internet, computers, kitchen appliances, elevators. And then tier 3 is usually generally majority of the loads that you don't necessarily need for these kind of life sustaining and continually being able to live within a space during these kind of disaster times. And that's your EV chargers, your dishwashers, irrigation, exterior lighting, and some plug loads. So this is like more of that standard procedure of how you look at the tiered loading within the building as you're using these power loads from a battery. And it really does take that electrical infrastructure to be able to manage where these loads are going, or switch into this, timeline where, okay, it is a disaster. How are we going to just tier 1 and tier 2? Do we not have enough energy to get through the night with tier 2? Are we just doing tier 1 to get us through that time sequence? And then this is just a quick graph kind of showing where the orange line is your solar energy production, and at the bottom is in black is your energy use of a single family home. Well, you're able to produce enough solar during certain timelines of the year that get you through that single day functionality into multi-day functionality, but there could be a portion of time where you're not having that daily energy production to get you through a multi-day sequence or even through that evening hours because there isn't enough production. So this is really just a design and calculation that has to happen during this kind of energy loading assessments in the beginning of projects. That's really critical to make sure they can get through certain disaster timelines. And this was just a quick note, kind of going back to the Lahaina fire, where a community member connected his microgrid to 2 other homes to support their emergency loading. So this could have been where, this individual had a battery at their house. They literally figured out the wiring themselves. They potentially just went to the breakers in the house and turned off the non-essential functions and then connected directly to that panel that fed the rest of the loading that needed within the building. So just some kind of questions that were coming out of this was, should batteries be required in WUI zones? What would that look like? How can policy and wildfire council support community or single family microgrid installations? And that kind of leads into this kind of discussion from NREL, where they did a study looking at, a series of different fires. There was a Thomas fire, the Camp Fire, and one other fire, the Witch Fire. And they basically were identifying how much cost would a microgrid be for a community-based, group to be able to, or entity of this community to pull in this microgrid that's kind of more holistic. It's not a single family home condition. You're looking at a network, a smaller microgrid that's basically a community versus a single home. And they were basically noting from this just came out in February this year, that it's about $1.4 to $3.3 million per megawatt to construct this, to support those spaces through these different aggregated costs. And that's really looking at, your land acquisition at the left here, construction, operations and maintenance. So specifically looking at this Thomas Fire case study, they said that, okay, this community would need 4 megawatts to be able to island from the grid and get them through disaster timelines. And that was about, $13.1 million to be able to implement. Well, naturally on the right, the fire impacts, and this is all taken into monetized impacts. Looking at all these different things that happen from the fire, obviously this is into the billions of dollars. While the benefits of the microgrid at the bottom is showing all of these monetized benefits that could come out of implementing this microgrid, and really how can we start to utilize this microgrid as a community scale into a model that can be funded from other sources. And just quickly, I'll talk about policy and funding for microgrids. As we kind of are looking at the single family scale, we're looking at the community-based scale. How can these things get implemented to make sure that these mission critical energy uses are happening during these kind of disaster timelines? And in California, there is the SGIP program. So, they do provide rebate rates. I think it's on the right, it's showing $1,100 for a battery per kilowatt hour that you could get implemented. This is coming out of SoCal Edison, PG&E, San Diego Water and Gas. And through 2025, there is still funding available that can get to these different individual homes. Separately from that, there is the SCE microgrid program. This program, SGIP, I think there's like 500 or 600, or maybe it's 280 million available at this moment. But then you look at a community scale microgrid program with SCE, and it's only 14 million. So the difference between those scales is kind of perplexing to me. And I think there needs to be a conduit and kind of some lobbying to get more funding around these community-based implementations. Separately from that, there is the Inflation Reduction Act, which does provide some level of funding for battery and solar installations. Unfortunately, there was a bill that just came through the House about 2 or 3 days ago that is putting this in jeopardy. So we'll see how that potentially goes through the Senate. But that is not great, obviously, for individuals that are trying to put in solar and battery, and specifically focusing into the disaster relief and resiliency for communities and single family homes. So much more to come on that. Happy to talk more about that. And then this is just a note here, just kind of, should there be more incentive funding, like I was saying, for these WUI zones where people are at wildfire risk, especially with being able to perform the essential energy loading that you need during these times of disaster relief. So that was really it. Thank you so much, and I'll pass it over to Heather.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to circle all the way back. So, you know, Brittany talked us through this word of a resilience hub, which people are using. You know, we need to sort of unpack that because people are, I've heard it used everything from a shade structure with a drinking fountain in a park to some of these advanced microgrid systems that Casey's talking about, and, emergency shelters and an emergency operations center, which is like a whole other universe. And so, as Brittany was talking through the functions and Casey talked through some of the technologies, I'm going to circle back to where Brittany started with why. So thinking about resilience, the fundamental building block of resilience is community. And we need to understand where we are in place and time in order to support that community. And as architects and designers, I think you have a really interesting and important role to play in thinking about what this means. And it's very different if you're talking about rebuilding in the burn scars or in damaged homes following the recent fires or any disaster, versus if you're preparing before a disaster and retrofitting a building versus if you're building something totally new. You have very different conditions. And so how do you make sense out of any of that? The first is to really think, well, who am I building for? And who are the most vulnerable people within that? Because if you build for the most vulnerable, everybody benefits. And, nobody sort of suffers because there's curb cuts. I'm sure you've heard this comparison before, but this curb cut analogy, ADA requirements are that you can, access the curb with a wheelchair, but that helps a lot of people. It helps kids on bikes. It helps parents with strollers. It helps somebody who's moving and has a cart, right? So if you think about how who might be vulnerable, who might have trouble, that's one really good place to start. And that's sort of this concept of social vulnerability. How vulnerable are the people in this space where you're working? And even beyond that, who are the people? What is the history? What is the culture? How do people connect? And that's kind of the next concept of resilience that we want to bring out, which is social cohesion. And communities that are connected are more likely to be able to help each other during a disaster, and they're more likely to return following a disaster, and they're more likely to be able to thrive over time, day to day. If you know your neighbors and you run out of milk, or you need to borrow a saw, which I recently did, or whatever it is, you're in better shape than having to go to the store every single time, right? And you're much more likely in the context of a disaster to be rescued by your neighbor than an emergency worker. So that piece of making sure your community is connected, that everybody's taken care of, is really important. And then sort of the next piece of that is what could go wrong. And there's a lot of ways to understand what could go wrong and a lot of levels of detail that you need to understand in terms of bringing that into your design. And whether that's just thinking through, well, I know that this area has, seismic issues and it has, whatever, and sort of knowing at a high level, or if you're really thinking from the site selection level and you really need to do analysis of this site versus that, and really how sensitive is this site and what are the best strategies. I think somebody actually put in the chat this risk taxonomy that's really how well do you have to understand what could go wrong? If you're a data center, you need to understand it in a different way than you do if you're a preschool, right? And the implications of that are potentially really different too. So The other piece is what has to go right. What are the functions that you're trying to achieve? And Brittany talked about how that changes over time. So what are the functions that you or your building or your client or the community need to achieve over time? And how does that change from normal times to times of interruption and times of recovery? And people often forget that recovery piece is really important. We don't just have a disaster and then we're back to normal, as I think many people across Los Angeles understand in a whole new visceral way now. So as we start to think about things, who is this for? What has to go right? What could go wrong? What are the consequences? And then what do you do about it? And so then thinking about, well, what technology do you need? Which strategies make sense? How much should I focus on fire protection versus a microgrid versus something else? Really depends on, ultimately what you're trying to achieve. So when we bring those thoughts together, it's important to remember that this context is changing. And so I had a conversation with an architect yesterday and they were like, but how do you even bring this up with your clients? Because my clients don't want to talk about risk. They just want to do the normal stuff. And that's a difficult conversation to have, but it's an essential conversation to have. And you as architects have actually a responsibility to be bringing this up of some level of understanding of what could go wrong. And framing it around that. What has to go right? What do you need to accomplish? I think we haven't really, as a design community or even as a larger society, begun to fully comprehend the magnitude of changes that we are facing. And those statistics that Brittany was showing about the increasing rate of disaster and the increasing cost of disaster is really happening. The amount of risk is increasing. What we haven't, I think people are starting to kind of understand that, but most people, when you think about your clients, how do most of you manage risk? I can answer. It doesn't need to be rhetorical. I don't know if I don't have the chat. I'll just say what I'm thinking of is insurance. Most people think about insurance. And the reality is that the amount of appetite to pay for insurance, what we call risk transfer, is not increasing. That means it falls back into most people's lap to deal with risk in some way, either before or after. And so this gets to the points that Casey was making of the investment in that infrastructure seems like a lot. I don't remember what the number was, some number of $1 million, right? It's a lot of money. The cost of investing that and then having the benefit of the backup power, having the benefit of the systems, of not having something burned down, for example, burning, if you were to think about prevention measures and risk reduction measures, the risk of the potential benefit of not having a loss is orders of magnitude greater, but we don't think about it that way. So I think we have to change how we're thinking about investment and that involves having some conversations about risk with your clients that may be different from what you've had to talk about before. It may be difficult. It definitely requires some training to understand what is risk and how do you manage it. Can you avoid the risk? Can you build somewhere else? Do you really want to redevelop this site? Do you really want to go back? You do want to go back. What could go wrong? What can you do about it? How much would that cost? But also, how much would it save? And changing how we think about those things. Okay. So that's a lot. So now let's bring that back to resilience hubs. We know that at the community scale, if community is going to be the fundamental building block of resilience, we need to achieve a variety of functions in normal times, in times of disruption, and times of recovery. Now, who does that? So local governments have a role. We need to make sure people have a place to gather, a place to be safe, of keeping everybody meeting basic needs, keeping people sheltered, keeping people fed, right? Those are all basic functions. They sort of happen for most people, you know, and we don't think too much about it during normal times. Those are all needs that need to be met during times of disruption, as well as some of the other functions that Brittany was highlighting of, you know, distributing resources, sharing information, refrigerating medication, all of those things, backup power. The disruption isn't one thing. It could be a power outage, and just a power outage, or it could be a power outage when the heat is out, or it could, or when the heat is extreme, or it could be an extreme heat, but not the power going out. Those are like all very different conditions in terms of what is the building infrastructure that you need to address that. So how do you start to say, well, what is the function of this organization or this household or this building? How can we meet those functions, starting with basic needs across a range of operating conditions in a way that manages risk and builds adaptive capacity? So in a resilience hub, does it make sense for one building to have all those functions inside it? The ability to house people and keep them cool and backup power and all of that? Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe the answer is we need those functions. What can this building support? And I think in the topic of resilience hubs, where we get into trouble is this very good notion that a lot of these resources should be provided in the community by trusted partners, which is totally true. And so we think of community-based organizations and things like that. And so we're going to maybe retrofit their buildings to be resilience hubs. And I think that sometimes the solution gets in the way of understanding the problem and what we're trying to accomplish. So taking apart that word, disaggregating that word around hub, and we think about it as a network instead, how do we achieve these functions locally within the community so that the community has its needs met, so that the CBO is a trusted partner for giving and receiving information, for example, for people to come but maybe it's connected with a health care center that's nearby that can deal with some other needs. And, you know, maybe there's a school gymnasium that's connected for the shelter and somewhere else that has backup power. And that within a quarter of a mile, say, you can meet all of those basic needs and you have a plan and you've got an activated community. And why is your community activated? Because they understand that they are managing risk and not relying on outsiders. So in a lot of ways, low-income communities in Los Angeles, communities of color, are more resilient in this way than more affluent communities, where people are more likely to be separated on their property, where people don't have a sense of neighborliness and connection, where they have an assumption that they're going to be rescued. So we see, for example, in the Boyle Heights Resilience Hub, for example, that is a project that USGBC and LADWP and ARIPS provided support, and Climate Resolve has played a really big role in trying to implement a resilience hub there for a really long time. And it's an amazing organization. It does amazing things to meet community needs. It is a trusted partner. It's in an older building in a constrained site. So how important is it that the backup power be in the building? That building is already serving a need. That organization already knows what its community's needs are. It understands what could go wrong in a very deep way. And it includes things like, extreme heat, but also all kinds of other social dynamics that we might not have thought through. And how are they taking care of kids and taking care of elderly people and across these different events? How does the community activate around it where that active support already exists? How does infrastructure show up in a different way? And so when we think about rebuilding, where we have these burn scars, thinking through these functions in a holistic way for the whole community. Not every building has to serve every function, but you have a network of things working together. And then you build, well, what is the right technology or strategy to meet this function across this range of conditions? For whom, over what period of time? What is the benefit of mitigating a risk versus the cost of dealing with it down the road? What are the benefits of thinking about these at the community scale and not just at the individual household or building scale? And how do we work with our clients and work with the communities around them to support and facilitate those networks and better decision making? Because at the end of the day, we are more likely to be reliant on our community. We have so many things happening at the government level right now. There's so much happening in the climate level. There's so many dynamic forces. Communities are the fundamental building blocks of resilience. How do we show up and help foster communities, support them, help them be vibrant, help them rebuild, and how do we do that through design? So I'll stop there.
That's a fantastic place to stop, Heather, but it also is like a launching pad for a much broader conversation. I think, please put questions into the chat if you have them. I think Stephanie Wright had a couple really great questions and comments here. And I don't know, Stephanie, you wanna just ask them yourself instead of me reading them, but
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this great conversation. I think I know most of you, so hello. This is a really great panel. Thanks for putting this together. I've been working for various cities for more than 20 years now, and what's interesting as cities across the region and maybe the country are in difficult budget times, trying to figure out how we serve our community with fewer resources and serve our community better and all of our community better. What does the panel and does this group think, where is the local government responsibility for resilience hubs? What is the private sector responsibility? How can we work together to create more resilience community-wide? And how can that collaboration turn into a day-to-day collaboration?
Well, that's a huge existential question that I think, it is philosophical, it is political. What is the role of local government in this is actually an extremely, in some places it seems, obvious and local government should show up. And in some places it seems obvious that local government should get out of the way. And I think that some of that tension about what is the role of government is kind of tearing apart our country right now. So how do we think about that in a totally different way of what is the public good and who is responsible for it and how do we create trust within the community? In terms of the funding, this is a really bad financial time for the city, the county, the state, and then there's the federal government. So what are the other creative financial mechanisms? And I'll just tell you that there are a lot of conversations happening. Brittany and I were at a session, so last week, this week, it's a blur. LA Clean Tech Incubator looking at, alternative financing for affordable housing and other things like that. There's a lot of discussion. What is the role of insurance and how does insurance show up in risk mitigation and not just risk transfer? All of these different issues are coming to the fore, and it's going to take time and conversation. But, I think, again, community is the fundamental building block of resilience. If you can create connection within your community, you can grow social capital and have more ability to influence and receive support from local government.
If I can add to that, because I totally agree with you, Heather. I did a community emergency response training course, which I highly recommend. And the ethos of that is like, one, don't become a victim because there's not enough support, right? There's not enough emergency responders to save everyone. So to try to avoid, for lack of better phrasing, like becoming part of the problem, like adding to the demand. And then second, to try to reduce the demand. So not only keeping yourself and your loved ones safe, but like how do you show up for neighbors, which is like really when we're talking about resilience, that's what it ends up being. I emphasize that because I think there's roles across that. Like the ideal is I would love for every space, regardless of private or public ownership, to have like a refuge service. But at the very least, like the example I gave, I think it was a multifamily complex that some of our colleagues worked on in Massachusetts that has like one outlet in every residence is backed up. And so they're not serving you walking down the street in times of disaster, but they're at least meeting the needs of the residents who are within their walls. And I think there's that does end up being an important role. I often seeing that the facilities that uh, are kind of getting engaged in becoming more formal resilience hubs are either government owned or CBO owned. And I think part of that is just the natural alignment with their mission. I think Boyle Heights Arts Conservatory, which I think that was the one you were speaking to a second ago, Heather, such a beautiful example. That's one where it's actually the building's privately owned, and they are a tenant within it. So that needed to be kind of hammered out, so to have a supportive private ownership. But they benefited extremely from a multifaceted partnership. So that included the city of Los Angeles, that included SEMO, that included Red Cross, USGBC. Like there was a whole bunch of folks who were at the table and helping to think through. They also benefited from Hilton funding. And one of the things that Climate Resolve had stressed is the like no strings attached nature of that funding was extremely helpful. That so often funding ends up being like too restrictive when the problems are not restrained. So to be able to be flexible in how you are meeting the emerging needs of retrofit once you are actually opening walls is huge. So it's a way. I think there's a lot of space for private to show up, you know, in one way around buildings that are owned and operated by private entities, but there's another that's just being part of the funding sources and going towards what you were saying, Heather, of when you're drawing the like the ROI circle or cycle, like there's a lot of people who and organizations and entities that end up benefiting from any sort of community resilience investment.
Thank you. I think this is going to be a continuing conversation, and I'll tap you all to see how we can partner together better.
Aaron, you had a series of questions here actually in the chat. I'll give you the floor a little bit.
Just to say thank you to everybody for coming together for this, because in a way, I think that some of this anyway was initiated by thinking right after the fire when the AIA LA was coming together and thinking about what programming, what should we be doing together. And I thought, should we be working to come up with community resilience plans for these neighborhoods that were like most directly impacted. And I reached out to ARUP, and we had a great conversation, which led me to think that more people would benefit from a similar conversation. So here we are today. And so thank you for that. And I know I've benefited from this immensely, which leads me to my next question, which is, where do we go from here with this information, which you've been sharing, and other work that ARUP has been doing? I just put in the link about something you guys have just released that helps us all to be more clear in our working in this way as we're speaking the same language. So, I mean, I think about somebody I'm a resident in Delray neighborhood. I have a neighborhood council. They would like to have capacity to think about community resilience. And as many times as I've asked them, should we talk about this? They say yes, and then nobody has any capacity to follow up on it. I think about at that scale, how can either citizen architect showing up at the community council meetings, we want to do this, but we don't have capacity to do this. So if there were to be a next step, specific to the remit of the AIA California and this community of practice, including you all. Thanks for joining our community. Could there be a call to action that, not that we define it today because we're running out of time and none of us probably have had lunch, but is that call to action, could it be such that we've got some asks when it comes to elected officials and what levers they can help us to pull? And then what might we do more specifically ground up? So if we're kind of trying to come at this from both sides, I know that I would like to take such a toolkit to my neighborhood council, and I would be putting time in on that, and I would be that capacity with what you guys have already shared. I could get something going, but maybe the AIA California would also be interested in this. Is this a question? I don't know. I think it's more of a, could this be an interesting next step? Maybe ARIP have already initiated some of this with certain community councils. Anyway, there's been a lot of good work in this space already. There was that one report that was dropped into that ULI and USGBC California already involved in this. So, I have to look at that more carefully, but maybe there's elements of that become a toolkit for neighborhood councils to build up a more kind of a grassroots. Yeah, so maybe the question is, what might be an interesting or smart for us to do next step? Maybe it's a call to action, maybe it's something else. What do you all think? This has been great. I really appreciate it.
I have a ton of ideas. So if anyone else want to go first, I feel want to.
Aaron, in the lead up to this event and the many emails and the thinking out loud, you professed something about once believing in centralized resilience hubs and now thinking, in terms of more in a distributed kind of way, and just sort of thinking out loud. And I have to say, I'm an Angelino now of 28 years, but I was born and raised in the UK in a place where community was a much more tangible thing than in this neoliberal landscape, the broken one, where no one wants to pay for anything, and government, as you mentioned, Heather, is when we look at the world around us and think about community, I see schools and houses of worship, let's say, as part of a kind of a satellite net gravitational pull. We've had successful legislation passed by my senior colleague at UCLA, Dana Cuff, in terms of educational workforce housing. There are large gathering spaces in the city, schools, namely. They have fields. They are amenities. I'm just trying to think practically in terms of sources of funding. Could we start to think about these spaces in ways that allow that mid moment in the when, Brittany, which is when the disruption happens and it's sort of beyond the capacity of the single family home or the block to hunker down in place. Anyway, just putting it out there practically. Today I've been obsessed with cooling centers, and we talk about them and we do studios about them at UCLA, and that there are resources. They're school gyms and libraries. It's on the one hand, thank goodness, and on the other hand, the kind of the designers in us, they lack an image. They're sort of unnameable. So I just wonder about the doubling up the recent education workforce housing does on public school lands and houses of worship. Sorry to be so rambling.
No, that was great comment, but I just wanted to also add in on the school side of things of looking at them as kind of resiliency hubs. And this is kind of an exploration we were looking into with that project I kind of very quickly noted during my presentation. But, you know, beyond just the microgrid side of it and these other passive functions, right? Having this specific space where maybe it's partially private and semi-private and then just school facility, being able to connect that back to the community and then have these different spaces that do open up to the community during these kind of disaster relief timelines. And, you know, with that kind of passive mitigation without even any energy use, if it didn't have a microgrid or what have you, if it was designed appropriately, it could provide that kind of spatial housing during the timeline of these kind of events. And I think that's super critical, especially even as we're talking about air quality and things like that, where maybe your single family home, like we're saying, you can't really hunker down because you don't have the air quality aspect dialed in at your home. But this specific hub that has been kind of designated and retrofitted or redesigned or new construction has these, you know, technologies that support that kind of interior air quality, which is seemingly the most critical at that kind of juncture. So all for that in kind of being able to utilize these kind of community spaces to support that.
I'll jump in just and you just saw this this question about third spaces come up, and I think that's such a beautiful concept and totally dovetails. I think that, you know, I don't know what AIA wants, you know, what you want your call to action to be, but I will give a call to action to you as architects, which is don't start with the answers, start with the questions. And start with the system and spend the time understanding the system of what is this place and how will it change over time, not just based on what's changed in the past, but climate impacts and other things, you know, that the stressors and shocks, but also, you know, what does this community want to become? How does it come together? Do the thinking, do the due diligence. Sometimes when we say resilience hub, it's like, well, if we just build the thing and it's a resilience hub, then we'll have resilience. And what we're trying to pose is yes and. Resilience, the hub should enable the community resilience. The hub isn't the community resilience. And so it's not that I'm saying or that we're saying, but you know, I'm not against hubs at all. I'm not against that concept. I will say unpack it. The hub concept is a whole kit of parts, and not every part belongs on every building, but every function needs to be met in every community.
Yep.
So what role will you play in understanding the needs of the community and understanding the needs over time and for different populations within that community, and also the capacity of the different buildings and the different places to serve those? And how will you advocate for the resources that you need to build that from local government? You know, local government should be thinking about these things. Every library, every senior center, every gym, every school, every park, these should be baked into the design. And every building should have some elements of asking these questions. And every designer should be thinking about these systems in a holistic way. You can have profound impacts if you start with the question and arrive at the right answers or the right technologies or strategies or partnerships.
Yeah, I love that, Heather. I had the yes and in my notes as well, because I think that, yes, that is one of the biggest conclusions I think we can see in working in the resilient space is like, yes, Mohammed, absolutely, we need libraries that are going to be open to everyone and can be a source of cooling and information. And yes, third spaces, like, shouldn't all McDonald's be cooling centers? And yes, like there's so many, especially seniors who when you're seeing these heat waves, they're not leaving their home.
Mhm.
And whether it's mobility restrictions or just the weight of heat alone kind of keeping people in unsafe conditions,
Yeah.
to what Casey was saying at the get-go, like that shows up in the design or the code for design of around passive survivability and thermal safety in the first place. So
Mhm.
it's these, um, there's so many things that to tune and intervene on.
Mm.
I think the I tempted to just underline what you said a second ago, Heather, that it is finding a space for that functionality across
Yeah.
buildings, across the community. And I, as a design tool, I think it's really, really helpful to do scenario planning. I and acknowledging that this is hard to think about. There's a read an earthquake book years ago that had the quote that uh there is a like it's an, it's an innate human desire not to contemplate the apocalypse. And it was around, you know, the big one in Los Angeles. Like that is a horrifying thing to consider. And it's so horrifying that there's a rock movie about it, right? So like uh, this is not a concept neutral thing to walk people through, and definitely not people who have experienced this trauma firsthand.
Mhm.
But it's hard to, I think, foresee what those needs are going to be without really having some thoughtful conversations around,
Mm.
um,
Mhm.
you know, what do people need at a baseline, and
Mhm.
if power is disrupted,
Mhm.
if there's a heat wave, if smoke conditions are such that
Mhm.
you can't open your windows, like um,
Yeah.
what needs to be available.
I have a question for you all. With what's happening with, like, let's be specific about LA, even though I know this is California wide. So thanks for the rest of the state for also joining. But specific to Los Angeles, have you seen the resilience planning take this approach? And is there basically something that we can support that's in motion already, or does this kind of thinking need to become more supported in a new way, i.e. it's not really going anywhere yet? Has it reached this point where we want to maybe map out all of these opportunities at the community scale, to understand, the fire station can do this in an emergency for this neighborhood, but in this neighborhood there isn't a fire station, so that need would need to be met by, a small private, urgent care place, which is in that neighborhood. I mean, is that level of mapping happening? And we would thus be able to support it, or is that level of mapping not happening?
I think at the level of granularity that you're talking about, I mean, and I obviously there's so many things. LA is so many things and so many places and so many people doing different things that none of us I think could answer that authoritatively. We could speak a little bit to what the city or the county or various groups are doing. I think this is very much aligned with the thinking that is going to be in the next version of the Blue Ribbon Commission report that comes out. I'm seeing them get more clear through each draft. And the next draft will be out, I think, middle of this month. So it won't have everything, but it's really at sort of an institutional level. What should the city and the county and other major institutions be doing? And I think supporting those kinds of initiatives is really important. I
Mhm.
think there's a ton that you can do as architects. There's a ton that you can do as AIA. I mean, you all mobilized really fast. You put together some really good resources. You've been continuing this conversation. And AIA is an important group. So, to the extent that you can support some of that mapping or work with partners to do it, I think that would definitely be filling a need.
Mhm.
You could start with that ULI
Mhm.
TAP report that I put in that really talks about, it gives a nice framework for this as hubs as a network.
Mhm.
So you could overlay that over specific communities and say, where would you find those different resources to provide and connect? And then what would be some toolkits for doing that? I mean, that would be a really big contribution. Um,
Mhm.
and then I just quickly have to give a shout out to passive design and everybody starting with, what can you do on site to limit the amount of resources you need from outside to support it. And just, I just wanted to lift that. I've heard it said a few times. I just really want to lift up. Passive design is a really good place to start. And then what are the connections within the community? So you can think about it as, how do you meet needs with existing resources on the site in the community before you have to go outside to local government to supplement? I've been so impressed by AIA's organizing across this. So, I think you all can do some thinking. We'd be happy to think with you. But that kind of thing of mapping what are the resilience needs within any community, and where can they be met now, and where do gaps need to be filled? What is a model for doing that? Would be a huge contribution.
I'm wondering what if I mean, I want to do this for Del Rey, right? What I want to do is to review that ULI report, go back to my neighborhood council, say I'll put in these hours. We'll try to map this for Del Rey, a neighborhood of 40,000 residents. And we'll do, and then I want to report back to a group that would be interested in such. I don't know who else wants to do this, but I kind of feel like the AIA, we've got probably enough folks to try to do this in a few neighborhoods and see how it works across different types of neighborhoods. So
just as you do it, leave breadcrumb trails so people can learn from what you learn along the way, and others can do it.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation about sort of resilience watersheds in some kind of way, right? Like how do you define the limits of the community? How do you begin to understand the granularity of this across Los Angeles? And what are the mechanisms that already start to self-organize this, to your point, Aaron, around resilience, neighborhood councils, et cetera? I think there's also fire safe councils and other kind of overlays that can happen that are well-versed in this and are actually born towards or are aligned more with, let's say, climate emergencies, sort of climate levels of resilience, more than maybe a neighborhood council might be. So maybe there's actually other kinds of partnering that can happen, and there's broader statewide sort of support mechanisms that can provide for funding of those and the creation of those. So I think there are community structures that can be formed around these that can maybe then be in partnership with LAUSD, for example, or at the local school level or neighborhood councils, et cetera, to begin to have overlays and understand where that scalability might happen. It's really interesting conversation, and I think that I agree with Heather. I'd love to see the drop many breadcrumbs, Aaron, or I'll just sort of like stake you out. And
oh no, I'll come back. I'll come back. I mean, I feel like and we've got other questions, and I don't want to take up too much space. But like for me, I want to try to apply this, and what sweat equity is required, I want to put it in. And yeah, I'll follow up. And I'm hopeful actually that after this, I'll write Will and others and find out if this could have a home within AIA, a more structured home. But yeah, well, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add to that as well, and what Greg was kind of noting about all these different communities, and there's all these organizations that can kind of support that, whether it's fire safe councils and what have you. But as this kind of resiliency framework is kind of developed, different community standards ultimately of how you kind of assess and how you identify the gaps, right? So a lot of it is a needs assessment, a gaps assessment, and being able to kind of utilize, I mean, we're talking about a very large swath, specifically just California, right? It's like 11 million people that live in the WUI that might not have the specific needs assessment or any sort of this structure going on at this current point in time. And I'm just trying to think of, if every single community does that, they get with the organization, they get a needs assessment, they go through that whole process. But at the same time, we have all of these, GIS platforms and things like that. Think of, look up a disadvantaged community. Yes, you have a designation, you have that site, we should have it at that level. And then basically using our technology, we can kind of identify general rules of thumb that are coming out of these resiliency standards, and then coming back and refining at the community level. So it's not this big leap to 0 to 100, it's 60 to 100. and being able to identify that community to community, because the scale is so big.
Mhm.
Just looking at this question about retrofits, I think
Yeah.
that is a really important and difficult question, and really what we need to be thinking about. I mean, the buildings that were lost will hopefully be rebuilt to a higher standard. But everybody kind of thinking about, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I don't live in the WUI zone. But looking at my own home through a fire awareness lens, I see a powder keg. So what does a retrofit program look like? We've been thinking about retrofitting of decarbonization of affordable housing for years. That's work that Brittany and I do a lot of, and it's really difficult from a policy and subsidy and sometimes technical level, but it's really important. And so how do we think about reimagining our existing built environment in the context of understanding fire and not forgetting, that that's what's going to happen is people start to move on, things start to get rebuilt, and there'll be the next disaster or the next distracting thing, and people will forget. And just remember that these are real hazards, that this is something that your design matters in this context.
Mhm. Well, one point for a lot of listeners who may not know as much about resilience planning and threat of climate. I mean, how many people in California do we know die of heat related, or it's the number is, do you know that, does anybody know the state number, or?
I don't know the stats, but it's more people do die and will die from heat than any other kind of disaster that we've hit.
And so when a part, and I think that one thing that is, I mean, that's one of the leading threats, right? And with the older people are going to face it differently, and some of the most at risk, we're talking about vulnerable people. I mean, there's kind of like a number one. So a resilience plan for many neighborhoods in LA, not even at the fire prone, okay, it's going to be heat focused. I would expect. So it's just to say, I mean, we're rebuilding for resilience, but we're also like definitely adapting a lot of our community resilience strategies for heat and related. But it's just to say, yeah, I'm not even sure that our conversation today has been focused. I don't think on rebuilding. It's been about community resilience. So building community resilience, yes. But not even necessarily rebuilding community resilience, although somebody might argue differently. I don't know what it was before, so I wouldn't say we're rebuilding community resilience. I think we're building community resilience. We need to build community resilience. And what you've shared with us is the way we need to be starting. Not the way I started, which is why I wrote you on the very first place, which is that how do I, as an architect, help some communities define a resilience hub somewhere, and so anyway, we've gotten past that. And that's been helpful.
I do want to point out, and maybe you already know, but I just put a link to an organization. It's a city governmental organization. I understand it's on the chopping block with the latest budget, but that's seemed to be a good step in the right direction.
Yeah. I mean, there was
Not-
even
not
a
the
resilience,
chopping.
there was a resilience program started under Trump's
Yeah.
first administration, I believe, that is now himself, he's chopping that program. So,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
don't remember the details on that. But I'm also thinking, like, maybe as a follow-up to this, I don't know how this gets shared out, Will, I can't remember, and Greg and Mohammed, but maybe as part of the follow-up, we can share some notes about how we might offer another space for this conversation to keep going, because I don't know about you all, but I mean, I would keep going, but then I'm realizing that that's probably not kind to the rest of the, I don't know how long you guys were thinking we should continue with the Q&A, but.
Sure. Well, Mohammed, just a real quick to your response about the budget. But from my understanding, CMO, or the Climate Emergency Management Office, or that MARTA is involved with, would become part of the emergency response team.
Okay.
So
it's
we're
getting
hoping folding that in maybe to achieve some sort of administrative efficiencies. But I do think that this is an opportunity for us as the AIA to really start providing a little bit more advocacy related to how to shape our government and its priorities so that we can achieve more of this return on investment for safer and cleaner and healthier neighborhoods and communities.
Before we conclude today, I do want to belabor the point that Heather made, congratulating y'all for like what an active voice you've been. And it took me a second to pull this up, but this was not you know, with the caveat that it's not exhaustive, but last month I had done a scan of like what did show up, right? What were the local research efforts? And you're seeing on the left side from, you know, blog posts or article event to larger scale research assembly over the months. And red is you guys. I like really not just got into the conversation, but in so many cases started the conversation across topics, both you know, the Los Angeles chapter, Pasadena Foothills chapter, et cetera. I think that's it's been really, really, really impressive and absolutely contributory to community resilience building.
That's awesome. Will, we need to print that and just huge banner. That's incredible. I just, you know, just me being me and being a little bit, I don't know, nonconformist. Can I just back to the decentralized version, which I fully support. Right? Resilience hubs is decentralized, as co-living and co-appearing with 7-Elevens, schools, what have you. I think that makes sense. I also feel like not designing a resilience hub is a missed opportunity, not for the love of design, but for the kind of the demonstrating principles. You know, 100 years ago in the UK, there was no such thing as a community center until the Delaware Pavilion. There was no such thing as a health center until the Finsbury Health Center. And it just getting a resilience hub built, even if it were a small one, would be a really good thing, I think.
We're building dozens of them across the state or supporting at least pieces, right? It's just not one thing. They are happening. They should happen. Get as far as you can on every project that you do. Start with, can this be a resilience hub? And how far can you get on every single project is amazing.
It's the
I just
piggyback.
wanted to address the frustration I think that people often feel because they fall short. They're always going to fall short. How far can you really get and get as many of them as possible overall? So I love your point.
Well, thank you, everyone. We're right at time. So if there's any final remarks, we really appreciate everyone that's been joining the call. This will be a recording that we save and archive and put on the AIA LA YouTube page. The one thing I'd like to add to this is with regards to Resilience Hub, you know, we can look at the classic old oak tree and the shade canopy that it provides as a resilience hub. And I look forward to seeing more natural systems and more opportunities for sort of unbuilding our environment with more nature and areas of reprieve that way. So with that said, I'd look forward to everybody joining our next conversation. We're going to be hosting the 10th annual Design for Dignity conference here at the LA headquarters, AIA LA headquarters. So we look forward to inviting you all to that. And with that, Greg, Mohammed, Aaron, Heather, Brittany, and Casey, one big round of applause for everybody on the call.
Thank you, everybody. It was
Zoom
really great.
applause is so quiet, but
Silent applause.
It's okay. It's awkward.
Wonderful.
But not that
Thank you
awkward.
so much. Thank you.
Thank you
So much.
Thank you all.
This is
Thank you
great.
all.
Great day.